Swans Lite. I'm a successful Lou. You are my best friend. Ooh, this album really hits the spot. Doesn't it though? You make really good albums, Bill Laswell. Oh, I think you make it, yeah.
Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. So this is of course another episode in our little mini-series on this show covering the vast discography of the band Swans. And so, in our previous episodes, we looked at, one of Swans' most beloved albums, Children of God, and then followed that up with a look at the live album counterpart of Feel Good Now. Children of God, album that saw sort of a development of new styles and ideas, showcasing a growth in the band that's really quite exciting. And so in today's episode, we're looking at, a very interesting album, a little bit controversial amongst Swans fans and stuff, but, this one certainly gave me a lot to think about when writing up my thoughts on it. So let's not waste any time. Today I present The Burning World by Swans. So, as we do for our episodes on Swans, let's of course ask ourselves, who were Swans? Well, for The Burning World, Swans consisted of only 3 official members in the band, apparently. So we have Michael Gira on vocals, guitar, production, as well as album cover concept and design. And then of course we have Jarbo on vocals and keyboards, and then the one and only Norman Westberg on guitar. And I believe it was for this record actually, that Westberg actually plays a combination of both acoustic and electric, which is kind of cool. As well as these 3 though, The Burning World actually features an incredible plethora of guest musicians who play such an array of different instruments. It's quite a vast number of people, and I think too many to list them all individually and stuff, but one name that does stand out amongst the vast list is the one and only Shankar playing the double violin, who is a bit of a favourite of mine, as I always remember his performance in Peter Gabriel's Secret World Live, which is an album my dad adored, and thus I grew up listening to that one. Should also mention that producer Bill Laswell also performs bass on this album. We will talk a lot about Bill on this one, don't you worry. So, of course, looking at The Burning World, the band's only major studio release and a somewhat notorious album within Swans' discography for a number of reasons. And so produced by Bill Laswell, this album is really weird in consideration to the band's output, as it is perhaps a very relevant story of what happens when you let a producer take over a lot of the creative decisions on your record. The Burning World, noticeably softer and oddly prettier in some aspects and more accessible than previous Swans records, of course. And personally, there's nothing wrong with trying new things, but when it comes to this record, I don't think the creative decisions have come together very well, and it just doesn't gel well with Swans' style of music, in my opinion. I will try my best to explain it over the course of this video, so let's just dive into it, shall we? So, The Burning World opens up with "The river that runs with love won't run dry." And so, I'll be honest, I think this is perhaps what makes me struggle most with this album, as at its core, it's a fine song, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. But I just find this one weirdly just really boring to listen to. It comes across as a rather light alternative rock number that, for me, just doesn't really stand out in any respective way. And I genuinely struggle to articulate my thoughts on this one because it just doesn't inspire anything within me. Like, I listen to this and I don't get anything from it, I don't feel anything, and that's really difficult to articulate. Looking at the lyrics though, I can try to formulate some thoughts, as when you read them, you're getting that sort of typical Jira style of, embedding a sense of darkness and existentialism into everything, which, in this song, it's oddly culminating into this sort of transformative thing in the final verse. But beyond that, I just don't find it all that interesting. And to be fair to it, the song is mixed well. When it gets to the chorus, you get some really nice backing vocals from everybody, and all the instruments coming through and gear are crooning away. It's very pleasantly mixed in all the channels. But I don't know why. This one just falls so flat for me, as it just doesn't provide me with anything that I find interesting to hear. And I think maybe it's because I kind of always had this weird dislike of tracks that feature orchestral strings that don't do much for the song itself. I would say a big example of this might be The Long and Winding Road of Let It Be. That is a song that really grates on me for some reason, which isn't probably not fair, but just my opinion. But yeah, when it comes to The River That Runs, it suffers greatly as a result of this production choice, I feel. Those strings just kind of don't do anything, but they're so prevalent in the song itself, and I think with this being the album's opening track, a lot rides on this, and having something that feels a bit bland really sets things off on the wrong note. So yeah, if you like this track, then fair enough, it's certainly very unique and it's certainly pleasant to hear, but I think it's easily one of my least favourite songs across this whole album, and I just think such a poor way to start this thing off. So let's move on to the second track then. We get Let It Come Down, which I think is a far superior track than its predecessor. And so I think with this one, especially with that opening, you're kind of calling back to that gothic rock style that we were introduced to in Children of God, featuring that kind of dirgy little acoustic riff, full of minor keys and whatnot. And now, considering my opinions on the orchestra for the last track, I find the inclusion of the single violin here to be a much better move, especially with it kind of having that weird Velvet Underground-y sound, that just pulls around this really unusual droning note. And I have to say here, I don't know for sure, but I have a vague feeling that this particular performance might have come from the one and only Shankar, but I should probably have looked it up before recording this one. So lyrically, this is another weird one from the year, of course. We should always expect that. It kind of just sort of discusses the varying natures of men in a rather abstract way, I feel. And weirdly enough, I'm kind of reminded of the kind of thing you'd see from the likes of Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, though I would perhaps say arguably a little less poetic in terms of the lyrical content, but that's probably a bit unfair, as Nick Cave does have an incredible way with words. But to get back to it though, I think this is a much more interesting song, and it feels much more in tune with the kind of thing that Swans were trying to do with their previous album, and to be fair as well, I don't know if this would have worked as all that well as an opening track, but it's definitely better. And yes, it's kind of a bit overproduced, as a bit too many choices have gone into it and stuff, but it's definitely more interesting in my opinion. So moving right along, we get the next track of Can't Find My Way Home, a Jarbo-led cover of Blind Faith. And so instrumentally, this song is a rather gentle, sombre affair, though, with it featuring some lovely rolls across the cymbals at various points, also while Jarbo just singing really brilliantly on this one. Now, there's a lot of passion in her voice, which comes across really well, and, to be fair, there's a reason why Jira says his vocals kind of sound kind of cramped the way they do. Like, I feel like he was a bit intimidated by Laswell's production, but it feels like Jarbo was much more comfortable, with her singing on this record, because it comes across as much more strongly than Jira's does for some reason. But yep, there's a lot of lovely elements on this one, though. You get, even with the strings instruments, forming some lovely notes at times that just help elevate certain moments on this track. And I should say, it does sound like Jarbo's enjoying herself singing on this one. I mean, I don't know if it's her best vocal performance, She's a really capable vocalist who's got such a, commanding power on her voice. And I don't think she does anything amazing on this one, but it does sound nice, and, maybe that counts for something. Who knows? So, next track, Mona Lisa Mother Earth. This is an interesting one. This is a bit weird, I think. So to start off, you get this sort of, rather hurried pace of the instrumentals, very akin to Swans in my books. And then you get some nice little backing vocals as Gear is just crooning away, of course, presenting to us this really unusual song that, I think it's about, basically getting in bed with Mona Lisa, which is really weird, but not really that surprising when it comes to Jira, of course, right? And so, the thing is though, there's some nice parts in this song, but I have to say I'm not the biggest fan of the constantly repeated frame of My Mother Earth, especially in the chorus, which is then backed up by Mona, Mona, Mona by the rest of the backing vocals and stuff. For some reason I just find that My Mother Earth refrain just to be a little bit grating, and I think even without Laswell's production I probably would still feel the same way, maybe, but who knows. But what I do like though is the last line when Gira just slides into that Mona Lisa part, that lovely elongated note, and there's something really satisfying about hearing that. But aside from that, not all that much else to say about this one. It's fine and there's nothing really wrong with it, but beyond that, there's just not much going on. So from here we move on to She's a Universal Emptiness. And so I'll say here, I can't really think of that many examples of songs that start with parentheses, but Swans decided to opt for it here for some reason. Don't know why. This one, I find it to be lyrically interesting, but I think that's as far as my enjoyment of it goes. And so when it comes to the lyrics, I'm not 100% sure what we're being told here. The more I read into it, the more I kind of get this image of the Virgin Mary and perhaps that religious imagery that's such a key part of the previous album and, previous tracks by Swans, of course, with Mary being presented to us in this rather dark and grim way. At least it's how I interpret it. And to be honest, it's kind of an interesting narrative for a song, but I just don't like the way it's being presented here, though. I just don't find it interesting. And it's mostly in the way that the instrumentals sound, it just kind of plods along. And it doesn't really do anything to stand out. It just sounds like a song without doing anything interesting, I feel, which is gonna come up a lot, I'm sorry to say. So, of course, album moves along and we get the next track of Saved, which is at least a little bit more interesting than what we've had previously, of course. So, at least in my opinion, of course. So opening up, you get this charming glide of the acoustic guitar, to start the whole thing off, backed up by this little ditty that pushes it along nicely. And it ends up being a very gentle little number, punctuated by this, rather dark, macabre outlook on the world and the lyrics, of course, for the most part anyway. And yeah, as Jira begins, we're sort of presented with this, just for me, it's kind of a notion of isolation. I feel, perhaps revealing. Before, irrespective of feeling so isolated and alone, he has been saved. Which I sort of interpreted to be that sort of quasi-religious imagery again. That existential feeling one gets perhaps from their belief in God and all that stuff. That's just far beyond my understanding. Is at least what comes to mind anyway. And as a result, it's kind of a nice, charming track, but beyond that, I just don't know what else to say about it. It's just, to be fair, it feels oddly a difference to how Gira normally presents himself in his lyrics, which makes this a very odd track within the Swans canon. I feel like when it comes to this sort of quasi-religious stuff, he's always just, just diving into the dark depths of it all, the horror and stuff. Whereas this one, he's kind of reaching out in exaltation of being saved and stuff, which is weird for Jira, but kind of interesting maybe. But I don't know what to make of this one, truth be told. Moving right along, we get the next track of I Remember Who You Are, another acoustic-led track with lead vocals from Jarbo. And so this one, I think it's weird because it's once again a song that really suffers from the production of Bill Laswell. The instrumentals have this odd, glorious quality to them. Very sort of like grandoirs and stuff, but especially with the strings and the woodwinds, creating those atmospheres. And Jarbo's singing does fit nicely within the mix of it all. It works very well. But when it comes to the lyrics, there's this rather dark, macabre edge to everything, I feel. This sort of odd imagery of a woman who's perhaps reflecting upon her past when they were young and different. And it's an interesting story, but I feel like that the dark and sinister edge, that it just feels completely lost within that production, and it's something that a lot of the songs on this album suffers from, I feel. And it becomes that thing where it's the kind of song where if you didn't pay attention to the lyrics, you'd nod along and think it to be a charming little number, right? And I think it's weird though, because when you consider, like when I consider the strength of songs, like Blood and Honey, for example, from the previous album, where Jarbo really pushed the track forward in this wonderfully dark, sinister fashion. It just feels disappointing that her strengths just haven't been utilised with instrumentals that actually back up her specific style. And so, although it's nice enough, I just think it's a really disappointing track on this album. But maybe that's just me. I just feel like this would benefit so much more from having that nasty, angular Swans edge to it. Like, it would bring so much more of that darkness in from the track, I feel. But no, maybe that's just me. And so, following up this, we get Jane Merry, Cry One Tear. Another oddly meandering track, that it sounds nice enough in some respects, and it's definitely among one of the better tracks on the album for some of it. We'll get to that in a bit. But for the most part, Ujira is crooning nicely on this one, giving us that deep rumbling baritone that's really satisfying to hear, of course. And the instrumentals are kind of nice, with there being some nice little embellishments from time to time that do stand out a bit nicely on this one. And lyrically, this one does feel a lot stronger too, I would argue. It's a sort of, for me, a dark recollection of the memory of some distant woman and how his treatment of her will perhaps condemn him, thus, perhaps leading him to begging her, almost for salvation, perhaps, just to cry one more tear for him, by the very woman herself, so at least he can, say that she felt something for him, perhaps, It's at least how I interpret it. And so it's very nice, but that is until the track reaches its climax, and it launches into the outro of him begging to the titular Jane Merry, and there's a change in the instrumentals. It's very sudden, but it feels like such a misstep in the wrong direction, because it just leads the track into this rather flat sounding section that has none of that intensity that it really ought to, I feel. And so, to try my best to explain it, I feel like this outro section would really benefit from being one of those loud, intense Swans moments, a pure explosion of sound which would make sense with that slow build-up the rest of the song was leading to. But instead of, having that explosion of sound and intensity and emotion and anger and stuff, it just meanders and plods along, and it doesn't go anywhere interesting in my opinion. And it's a shame, because I like how this song starts, but I really don't like how this one ends. And I'd argue it's, once again, likely a fault of that production style again, and it just doesn't gel well with the style of music Swans would do, which is such a shame, but to be fair, we kind of knew that this was coming with a bunch of these songs, right? It's very bizarre. So after this, we get the penultimate track of See No More. And as soon as this one begins, we're sort of thrown into that odd angular style of, classic Swans again, I feel, with an odd little riff that pushes back and forth on the guitar, backed up by this, what I would describe as sort of military-sounding beat on the drums. It's interesting, but once again, I just wish the production pulled those nastier edges out of the music, just highlighting this sort of grim, dark, snarling attitude that is clearly prevalent in these songs, but just completely buried under Laswell's production style, I would say. In any case, when the song does get going, though, it sort of changes and reduces it all down as Gira begins, singing the song, and essentially covering what is easily one of his most favourite themes in all of his music: the sun. And, in this one, the sun, basically traversing the journey the sun makes during the day, tying it into that sort of quasi-religious themes as well by describing it as God's son. So, a lot of Jira's favourite themes, right? And for the most part, it does conjure up a lot of interesting imagery and makes it for one of the better songs on this album. But once again, it's that kind of soft style of production for the vast majority of the song that just doesn't draw out the right strengths that are hidden somewhere in this song, I feel. And it's a shame because it's so evident that so many of these songs have so much potential, it feels, but any of that edge is just completely lost in an overabundance of instruments and a softer sounding palette across the whole board. It's such a shame to hear because these songs could be so incredible and intense, I feel, but they just don't come across as so, essentially. And so, of course, we move on to the final song, which from my understanding is actually a bit of a favourite for a lot of people on this very album. God Damn the Sun. So this one, oddly enough, I think actually benefits from the stripped back quality, I feel, as it kind of, it's much more stripped back in terms, not just in terms of Swans, but actually in terms of Laswell's production. He hasn't just, overloaded this one with an abundance of instruments. And as a result, it lets that lyrical side of the track really stand out much more, I feel, which is perhaps where this track personally shines. And across the track, given that dark, macabre imagery, so quintessential of Gira, of course, lamenting the loss of a loved one during a drunken tirade, I feel, with it culminating in the repeated refrain of God Damn the Sun, which is a fantastic piece of imagery, isn't it? Damning the very thing that provides life to the earth itself. It's kind of funny, but very interesting, I feel. But once again, I wish it had that more angular edge to it, though, letting it become a slow build-up to something explosive and cathartic. But of course, Laswell's restrained, held-back style it swallows the composition in softer layers, and although it works a little bit better on this than most of the other tracks on this album, it could have done so much better. Because the whole album just doesn't benefit from this style of production, and it's a shame because there's so many good songs here, but I just don't like what Laswell did with them, essentially. So, there's a lot to unpack on this one, isn't there? And I will try best to articulate my thoughts, to be fair. So, from my understanding of the story and everything, The Burning World came about when Swans signed to Uni Records, which came upon, following on from the surprise success of Swans' cover of Love Will Tear Us Apart by Joy Division, which, it's a cover. I don't really much care for covers for the most part, to be fair, but at least it's kind of interesting anyway. In any case, they signed to Uni Records, and then Bill Laswell ended up co-producing the album alongside Gira. But it seems to me, though, that Laswell really spearheaded much of the production, utilising his own methods and ideas, rather than utilising Swans as a band. And his choices to include a wide range of musicians and instruments, it's certainly interesting, but to me, it's such a step in the wrong direction. Because the songs on this album just haven't benefited from having any of these layers, and instead it just becomes so bloated with unnecessary decision making, it feels to me. So it's odd because when it comes to the earlier Swans albums, even the early No Way era, for example, Swans are able to drag so much out of their music with arguably very little. And even on Children of God, when the band started opting for more typical song structures, there was still that nastier, angular edge to it. That dark, macabre nature of everything that makes it so interesting to listen to. And although Bill Laswell is responsible for a great number of interesting records, it just seems like he completely missed the mark on this one by not attempting to draw out any of that darkness, and instead treat it like any other record he would normally produce, which it just doesn't work for a band like Swans, it feels, and it's a shame because it's a fine record for the most part, but weirdly enough, it's completely overshadowed by the repertoire of Swans as a band, as they're capable of so much more than what they were given here. And thus for me, it just doesn't work all that well within the band's discography. And I wonder if this was perhaps, because Gira was, as he described, very intimidated by the label and by Bill Laswell, and perhaps, relinquished creative control of the project, when in actuality, focusing on it through his own vision would perhaps benefited this record so much more greatly, I feel. And so, one thing that stands out to me on this album, is a little quote from Gira discussing the recording of this album. And according to him, the album was recorded piecemeal, with no communication between musicians. So whilst I can understand this can be beneficial in some respects, maybe to certain bands and production, because production can be a really lengthy process and stuff, I feel like this was such a bad decision when it comes to a band like Swans, as they're a band where the interplay between all the musicians is key to creating the right sound that the music needs, and opting to record a vast number of musicians who haven't spoken to each other, and as well are probably only taking direction from Bill Laswell, it just ended up making everything feel disparate and disconnected to each other. And for me, it doesn't benefit the kind of music Swans do at all. It just greatly lets down the overall experience as a result, and it's such a shame of it. And so yeah, as you can probably tell, I'm really not a fan of this record at all. Weirdly enough, when people criticize albums for being overproduced, it's a term I can't stand because I feel like a lot of people misuse that term. But this is an example where I would personally use that term, as I feel like Laswell did overproduce this one, and completely in the wrong way, I feel. Everything does sound nice, and it's recorded well, it's mixed well, but it just doesn't gel well with Swans' style, and thus it lets everything down as a result. And it's such a shame, because there's a whole host of amazing musicians on this record, but even their contributions just aren't utilised effectively. And instead, it feels like too much, when probably a less is more approach would have maybe benefited this a bit better. But it's such a weird story within Swans canon, and it's disappointing to me because I think the band deserved better than what they got, If the band had a producer who understood the vision of Swans and what their output is and what their music achieves, then maybe this record could have worked much better, and we could have had something that would be a really interesting follow-up to the previous album, Children of God, one that still ties into that quasi-religious imagery really well and sort of handles it in a different way, I feel. But alas, it wasn't meant to be, and Swans' experience with a major record label was an incredible letdown for them, and it's a shame because it's not the worst album of all time. Don't get me wrong, it's not the worst album of all time. It's fine, there's some nice songs in it, but it's just disappointing within Swans' discography, because they've done better than this, even just by themselves they've done better. And as well, for being on a major record label, they deserved way better than what they got, and it's such a shame that it didn't work out for them. But in a way, we know, in retrospect, these things worked out themselves in the end. Everything was fine for the band, it all worked out. But it must have been such a jading experience for Michael Gira to finally, feel like he'd made it perhaps, and then everything just fell apart as a result. What a disappointing thing to have happened for them. And so, I think with that, we're going to come to the end of our episode of Weird Music there. I do apologise. I feel like my opinions have been maybe a little bit too critical, but I think that's because I find this record very disappointing, and I feel like it deserved so much better than what the band got, essentially. And it's a shame that Swans' first and only interaction with a major record label just ended up being a sour experience for the band, resulting in an album that just feels weird and alien within their repertoire. But it seems like the experience probably taught Gira and the band a lot, though, as they would go on to create some of their most interesting albums within the early 90s, and then go on to make soundtracks for The Blind eventually, which is going to be a fascinating album, but very difficult one to dive into when we get to it. Of course, that will all come at another time, though, because in our next episode, we're going to cover a record that I'm very interested in hearing, and that is the Burning World's live album counterpart, Anonymous Bodies in an Empty Room. And I haven't heard it yet, but I'm very excited to hear this one, as I think it will perhaps showcase, a much more true sense of how these songs were meant to be heard. So, yeah, we will get to that eventually in our next episode. For now, though, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best, take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye!